I thought I'd come and show you and tell you about a mistake I made, and I wasted a whole day on it because it was twice as hard to undo as it was to make the mistake in the first place. And the mistake was pretty difficult in the early making. What I did, and this is the piece I've got to redo, I sewed it together all the way down. I was kind of disappointed in this, and I decided to do the one that has the problems first. Um, the first one I bought was perfect. The grain on it was aligned, and it was in really, really good shape. The second one I bought was a lot looser, uh, and it had this big seam right down through the middle of the piece. That didn't make me happy, though I can use it and it won't be a big deal to use that piece with the seam on it. But I sewed it together with what's called a lock stitch, and my sewing machine has lots of fun stitches, and this lock stitch is a very tight stitch that sews front, back, front, side to side, front, back, front, side to side, all the way down it, which makes a very tight and durable seam. The last thing I want is to make all this and then have it fall apart. So I got the whole thing sewn down the long part, and then I have these pieces that are the ends, and they have to be sewed into the end of the into one end of that tube that you make by sewing it together. And it makes a kind of a bag. And the other end just will be sewed onto the top. Well, I decided to try it on the mattress before I sewed the other end, one side only, onto the top, and then I would have to put it in the mattress again. But I was really glad I took the time to do that because my measurements were wrong, and my bag was huge. It needed about anywhere from 3 to 5 inches taken out of it. And so when I sewed this end in, I couldn't figure out why it did that, but it just puckered really, really bad. And so the sides did. So I had to take all of that out, and with a lock stitch, oh my, that's nearly impossible. So what I ended up doing was cutting out the bottom on the seam and then going along that seam, and here you can see, perhaps, I had to go along that seam and take all those threads out, and that took me longer than sewing the thing together. It took forever to get this thing apart. I am notorious for measuring and measuring and measuring and trying it and trying it. But I was kind of in a hurry, and I said, well, I measured it, and I just came in and did it. And now I know why I'm notorious for measuring it over and over and checking it over and over before I begin. So it's always a good idea to do that. One of the problems I have now is that the fabric is fraying quite a bit. It's not so bad, and I cut a wide enough seam that it shouldn't cause me major difficulties. But lesson learned. And I'm ready to sew my bag and then stitch it around the top and sew the other one. I have two of these, of course, one for each of the mattress pieces. But a whole day lost, lots of aggravation, a little bit of a bad attitude to go along with it, though I knew it was my own fault, but anytime you have to do something like that, it just makes you have a little bit of a negative attitude about what you're doing. So yeah. When you're doing anything where you're making up your pattern as you go, be sure to measure over and over and over. And then before you sew it together, measure it again, just for the sake. It's always good to kind of fit it to the piece. That's what I usually do, but I did not fit it. After I cut it out, I didn't fit it to the piece. So now it's fitted, it's recut, and it's ready for the sewing machine. And I will probably visit you a little bit there, but not too much, because sewing is pretty boring when you're just sewing straight lines. There's a couple things I might show you in the sewing, but anyway, yeah. So this time I cannot do it as easily as I did it the first time. So I'm going to set this for a simple lock stitch. And the reason I'm using the lock stitch is because when this is pulled or stretched at all, I don't want that seam to come apart, and the threads to spread. I will go over it 2 times. I'll go over it this way, and then I'll go over a lock stitch on the edge as well. And that will keep me from having those kind of issues. So I'm going to go ahead. You can see what my sewing machine does, and you will notice maybe that the lock stitch is a lot more involved. Takes a lot more sewing than a normal straight stitch. Be sure I've got that in the right place, and I do. I don't need any more snafus. You can see that it's a very slow process as the sewing machine works its way backward and forward and then to the side. This sewing will take me a little while because I have to do all of my edges that way to assure that I get very good wear on these seams. And you can also see the effects of having to take it out and now putting it back in, how it's, the whole thing is really raveling a whole lot more than I would expect it to normally. My sewing machine is jumping just a little bit, and I need to check this back side, and I have a broken thread, but I need to check this back side to see if there's a reason why it's jumping. And I don't really see any reason why it would be jumping, so it's probably just catching a little bit. I've got to back this up to the place where my thread broke, which is right back here. And I need to rethread. Now anytime, and if you sew a lot, I get it wet, but anytime you break a thread, and I've got some little bitty scissors over here. Anytime you break a thread, it'll really simplify things if you'll just go ahead and cut that thread off. It'll go into the needle a whole lot easier. Because if the thread is frayed, it goes through that needle a lot harder. We got it in the right place. Look at that back. That's looking just fine. I have to cut those raveling strings off a little bit because I will tend, if I don't, they'll just keep raveling. Every now and then I have to stop and cut off this part that's frayed just to get it out of my way so I don't end up with a bunch of tangled up threads. This is a very slow process, sewing this, but I brought you back because I want to show you the seams. Because this has a heavy seam right here, I've got to stop and change my stitch for just a little bit. You can see on the underside it's a heavy seam, and on the top side it's a heavy seam. They don't match each other exactly. They should match each other a little better than they do. But right, as I approach that, I've got to come over and reset my sewing machine for a straight stitch. Also across both of those heavy seams. Back and forward again. Kind of got it off there. And then when I'm on the other side of that, I will go back to the lock stitch. The reason I do that is because a lot of times when you're sewing with one of these sewing machines that kind of senses everything, and you come to a real heavy piece of fabric for just a minute, like this is triple right here, and then it's got another piece of fabric it's sewing, so it's 4 times as thick. The sewing machine will get out of sync, and sometimes it takes it a little while to get back, and so I go ahead and make that little thing happen there and just sew back and forth across it so that it's still a good strong seam. And with the other parts having the lock stitch, that doesn't tear real easy, is what I've found in the past. I've also noticed that there's a little bit of a slug to this fabric, and that will also sometimes create a little bit of a reaction in a electronic sensor-driven sewing machine. So those are just some little things you learn from the sewing machine that you have. It adjusts, but it takes it a little bit to adjust, and when you're going back and forth, sometimes it's better just to be the bigger person and make it work right. My seam that I made to be right in the middle of the back. And so I'm going to take this short side and I'm going to fold it in half and mark it with a pin right at half. And I'm going to come over this, line that pin up with my seam and repin it on that seam. Now that's going to be lined up exactly with the back. You wouldn't have to pin this all the way around, but I find that it's better to do it simply because then if you have a discrepancy, instead of having tucks and major things like that, you can just have, you can just adjust it. So I'm going to knock out a few pins over here. And I'm going to come right over here to the side and I'm going to pin right in there. Then this one is going to come right even with that. Now normally I'll make a cut there. And I'm going to go ahead and make that little cut. I always like to make it from a side and not straight on. And I make that cut right there. And I'm going to the other side. Sometimes when I cut it and it doesn't come out even, that's another little snafu that is a kind of a pain in the neck. But it's better to do it at this point than to get it halfway sewed and realize you've got to make major adjustments in a half sewed side. So it's if you have a little cut, if you didn't cut it too far, it's not that hard to overcome that. As I get into the more long edge of this, my pins get a little farther apart. I don't know, I just do it that way. I figure right in the beginning after I turn a corner, I need to line things up pretty good so the pins get closer together. And then as I get on down the side, the pins will get a little farther apart because things are usually lined up at that point. Okay. Now I'm going to cut me a little corner here. And again, cutting that at an angle tends to make it not cause your corner so many problems as trying to cut it too straight. I will also take these pins out before I get to them on the sewing machine. That's just another part of how I do it. At this point, I can check, before I cut it, I can check and make sure that my next seam is pretty much right. Okay, let's see. Yes, it is. So that's a good thing. I'm not going to have to cut it again. I'm not going to have to undo it and cut it. Again, coming in at a kind of an angle. I don't know if you can see that, but I come at an angle and I cut my little clip at an angle, and that will sew a little nicer than if I cut it straight up and down. I've been sewing for a long time. When my girls were little, that's how I earned the extra money that was needed for things, you know, those things that mamas have to buy for their kids because they need to, whether they really need to or not. And then there were times when it was necessary for day-to-day sustenance, but most of the time they were spent on needs that might not have been needs to everybody, but to this mama, they were the needs. Okay, I'm going to cut this corner right over here. Now the next one, when I put it on, will be just a, oops, that came off. The next one, when I put it on, will only be sewed along one long side. And the reason for that is that I will sew it by hand after I get the cushion into the cover. So now there we are. We've got our piece, and make a little bit of a adjustment because that's just a little bit loose right there. I'll make it all along this side. Oh, I think that's where it was. I had a long place that was kind of loose. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and sew this, and I'll sew it twice like I did the sides. I'll sew it all the way around at my 5/8 inch stitch, and then I'll come in to a 3/8 inch stitch and sew it around a second time, and that'll give me a double lock stitch. The edge won't fray so much and the lock stitch won't pull. Okay, now I'm going to attempt to put this on here. Last time it was just way too easy. And so, as a result, I knew it wasn't right. When I start these on, first I got to line it up right. the back side is on this side over here. And this seam goes on the back side. So the way it's going to be lined up, and this is the end of the bag. This is the part I sew on first. The second side has just been sewed on across one end and slightly a turn of the corner. That just makes that corner easier to do. I'll still have to do a couple of corners. Also, notice that I have done a triple stitch zigzag all the way around both pieces on the outside, and that will just keep it from fraying really bad while I put it on and while I'm sewing it on into place. So the way I do this is complicated, of course, because I don't do anything that's not complicated. But I'm going to start with the bottom of the bag, right against the bottom of here. I've got this seam over here on the back side, and this side is going to come over here, like this. I start with the bag wrong side out, and I'm going to turn it right side out over my piece of foam. This is not an easy process, but it's not an impossible process either. We'll get it a little ways from this corner, and I'll have to go in for a little bit and clean up those corners and one thing and another like that. So I'm going to come down here and get it over that corner, and we'll come over here and stretch it over this corner and kind of fit it over that corner and this corner, and just kind of, I don't know if you can see it, but I'm just going to kind of pull that down like so. And you can see as I turn the bag right side out, it's going to come over this cushion. I'm going to just pull it right side out, and you can see how it's kind of coming over that cushion. Go over to the other side, do the same thing. I'm going to work it over here, and I kind of have to stick my hands down in there and squash that cushion in just a little bit so that I can push this thing on there. I try to go a little farther with each side. I try to come a little farther with this side than I went with that side, and then I'll try to go a little farther with that side than I did with this side. And as I work it wrong side, otherwise, with this memory foam, you would never step it in that bag. It just wouldn't happen. And if you did get it in there, it wouldn't be straight. It wouldn't be like it was. And also, if I hadn't put this cloth on the memory foam, it would be a nightmare to make it do that. So I've worked with the memory foam a little bit in the past, and those are just things I learned. Get it a little bit farther this way before I walk back around to that side and get it a little bit farther again. And I just keep working this down until I've got the entire mattress inside this bag. Sometimes you have to jimmy it a little bit as you go sometimes you have to come back in the end and smooth things and get everything where it's got to go. The second one will not have this seam on it right here. The reason for that seam is just because it came that way in the bag of canvas that I bought. It had that seam. The first one didn't have that, and I was a little disappointed when I saw it. But it will fit under one of those stripes I was talking about. And hopefully you'll get to see that later on. You can see I'm getting a little bit close up to the top now. And it's really almost there. A couple more transfers from side to side and I'll have it done. Yeah. Fitting nice and firm this time. Nice and tight. It's not too big. Makes it a little harder to put on, but that's okay because it's what it's supposed to be. And we're up here at this end and you probably just can't even see it. I probably should have turned it around so you could watch the end process. But yeah, walk over here, pull this up, and then I'll turn it around. Yeah, that's what I'm going to need to do. Is I'm going to need to just really smooth it out. I've been removing a lot of strings as I went. I'm going to turn it over to this side for a minute. Do the same thing. You can see it's come all the way up here to that sewn side. And everything, there's a string that needs to be clipped. I always pull the string away from what I'm clipping it just so that I know I'm not going to clip the fabric. Oh yeah, that is pretty good. Now I'm going to turn this around. And you can see the working end of this. There we go. Yeah. And you can see a few of the little stitches from the first time when I had to take that out. Yep, you can. A few little pieces of thread have got to be taken off. I'm going to turn this over. Went on there pretty good. I'm going to sew it close and then take it out and put it out there. It won't be attached until I make those other pieces, but there it is. Yep. And this will be brought up and sewed into place on there. I'll pin it and then sew it into place on there. And that will be my first cushion, mattress cushion. There are 2 of these, and when they fit in together, they make one full-size bed. So now you've gotten to see that. Okay, I'm going to show you a little bit about setting this up to sew it and to finish up the underside. I've tucked it in the right amount. I've pinned along there. You can see this will have the pins the same way, but I don't want to pin it yet because I want to be able to reach in and make sure as I'm sewing that I'm not catching this inner cover with the threads. And so I'll leave that kind of open until I've gotten up around here, and then I'll pin inward, and I can do the same thing from each side. I can watch those threads so that I don't sew that together. The last little bit will be about this much, and I'll just have to be really careful not to catch those. But you can see how that is going to go together on that end. I'll do a nice hidden stitch so that I don't, so it doesn't look bad. And then when I'm all done, I will probably steam my cover just a little bit so that I get a real good, clean, taut finish after the fact. I've got my thread on my needle, and I don't use a real long thread for this sewing. I'm using a complex stitch, so it's going to use a lot of thread, but the last thing I need is to be trying to undo tangles, and this is a double thread, so it can tangle real easily, and you can end up with knots that you don't want to have. I'm going to move these pins back here behind me. I'm really working from the wrong side here, but I wanted to start with this side over here. And what I may do, just to make it more visible, if I can, is stand this up. And I think I can. I'm going to raise this up just a little bit. Yeah. And let's see if we can work it that way. Okay, I want this lead thread, what's on the other side of the knot, to be on the inside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here. I'm going to go just beyond the area that I have stitched, because I stitched around that corner. And I'm going to come back this direction. Now, that just gets me started. And it's really at an awkward angle, so I may not be able to do this for very long. Okay, there we go. Now I'm just about back to where I was from the stitching that I made on the sewing machine. I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to go back into that stitching, back into this side, and I'm going to come beyond where that last stitch was, about a stitch length. Pull that in, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to stitch back to the previous stitch. I'm going to stitch back from that previous stitch keeps it from being just back and forth type of stitch that really shows up. The stitch is going to be completely hidden when I'm done. So I'm going to reach back down in there, come over there, and come back to here, go back behind it, back to the stitch I had before, come back on this side, and come back about another stitch width. I'm constantly adjusting my thread so that I don't get tangles. I'm going to come over here and go about back to the previous stitch. Back over here, come out another stitch width, and just keep doing that all the way around here. As soon as I get to a needle, I will check it. And I've got it far enough away from the edge right now that I'm not worried. Well, here I am several hours later, having a big supper, having worked at it a long time, taken some time off to take care of animals and one thing and another. I'm back on this. The light off of this is causing me to look a lot darker. And there's not much I can do about that because it's such a light surface. But I am just almost finished with the hand sewing on this first one. I have a whole other one to do when this is completely finished. The stitch again is 2 forward, 1 back. Starting even with that one, you go 2 forward. You come 1 back to the last stitch. Come back down to the other side, 2 forward. What that does is it keeps the stitch hidden and it doesn't move the fabric from side to side. It keeps the fabric drawing up evenly across there as you go. I have this much left to go, and that's all I have left on this, other than just wiping it down, steaming it a little bit, and that sort of thing. And then I'll be able to take it out and start on the other one. I'm hoping to have them done fairly soon because it's been a long process. And sometimes you just got to get it over. Yeah, just needs to be done. And that's where I'm at. I've been working on these, the cushions in the bed for quite some time now. In fact, when you see these videos, they'll probably be all strung together in one video, and you may not realize that there's over a week's time in there.